Hello and welcome again to Cup of Tea's 3-minute reviews. And the time it takes you to brew a cup of tea, we'll cover an entire movie. My name is Tim, and I'm joined as always by Michael.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me. We're doing something a little bit different this month. It is, of course, Halloween month, which
Ooh.
means which means I watch a different horror movie every single day during the month of October, and I've been doing this for 10 years now. Michael, how do you feel about horror films?
Tim, I have seen maybe three horror movies, and I did not like any of them. I am not a fan of the genre. I do not like being scared, and I have avoided watching these movies at all possible circumstances.
So, what we've decided to do is to get Michael up to speed a little bit and to allow me to revisit some classics. We went through different lists of classic horror movies, genre defining horror movies, and we have whittled it down to 4 selections that Michael is okay with and that I think are essential viewing for anybody who's interested or wants to learn a little bit more about the genre. Without further ado, this week we are starting with one of the original horror films from Universal Studios in 1931. It's Frankenstein. It's a horror film starring Boris Karloff. It helped define the genre, and it has held up for almost 91 years. Michael, please give us your hot take.
Tim, this movie was my cup of tea. I didn't really know what I was getting into. I'd read the book, I'd never seen the film, but I really enjoyed this. It was like watching a piece of history. I feel smarter and wiser for having seen it. What about you?
This movie is absolutely my cup of tea. I love this movie. I love the look. I love the feel. It's got this incredible vibe. The sets are amazing. The look, the costumes. I love it.
So, Tim, for folks who aren't familiar with Frankenstein, give them a rundown. What's it about?
Based on a Mary Shelley novel of the same name, the story follows a young scientist who becomes obsessed with the idea of creating life. And he uses his scientific know-how and his laboratory to build his own man out of stolen corpses. Ooh. Michael, you say this was your cup of tea. Please give us a few reasons why.
It was hard to not feel like I was watching a classic during this movie. It was steeped in history. I felt there was so much going on here that is just timeless. I really enjoyed that about this movie. And nearly 100 years later, it's held up incredibly well. I was entertained the entire time I was watching it.
That's what I'd like to call out. It's entertaining. A lot of classics are like big and stodgy and they feel ancient. This one moves really fast. It's got a really great momentum to it. It's got a great pace. This movie just clips right along and it keeps entertaining. From start to finish, I was engaged and I was entertained all the way through. This movie moves.
As our viewers know, I do not enjoy any film that involves a lot of walking or the boring things. And this movie has none of the boring things. It is all the core plot elements that are happening one after another. It's about an hour, 10 minutes long, and that is an efficient story to tell for a really historic, weighty piece of literature.
I really love the look of this movie. I'm going to call that out again. This elaborate laboratory in which Frankenstein works is iconic. And the look of Frankenstein, the monster himself, is absolutely amazing. It holds up so well and it looks so good. I mean, this thing looks better than a lot of the makeup effects we see today. And honestly, if you think of Frankenstein's monster today, you are thinking of this design that was done almost 100 years ago, and that's incredible.
The thing that impressed me most about this movie was how well they told the story of the monster and Frankenstein. If you're not a big follower of this story, you might think of the monster as the villain, and the monster is not the villain. And they do a wonderful job of painting Boris Karloff as Frankenstein's monster in a sympathetic light, but they don't overdo it. They make you feel his arc. They don't just tell you what to feel about it. And I think that's something that's really hard to do, and we've really lost a lot of that in modern movies. I really enjoyed the fact that they didn't talk down to me in this movie. They let me feel what needed to be felt versus just telling me how I should feel about things. I thought that was elegantly done.
Now, Michael, we're going to shift to the bad. What didn't work for you about the film?
As a modern viewer, there were certain edits and cuts that were a little jarring. In particular, they weren't showing any violence on screen. That's a product of the time that this film was made. So when people were getting attacked by the monster, it would often just cut. And unlike a elegant fade to black, it was just literally a jarring cut sometimes. And so as a modern viewer, used to a little more polish, that pulled me out sometime. What about you, Tim? Was there anything that didn't work here?
One thing that worked for me, but I don't know if it would work for everybody else, is the way the film is shot. It's very subjective storytelling. These days, we're really used to kind of getting in a character's point of view, and like we get these certain close-ups and reaction shots and all of this. A lot of the filmmaking here is very presentational, and it's sort of the camera is held back and watches things take place and watches events play out. There's not a lot of cuts, so it's a very subjective style of filmmaking, and I don't think we're used to that. And I think that's one thing that modern audiences are going to be watching this and going, this doesn't feel contemporary. I don't think that should turn you off. I think there's a lot of really amazing stuff happening here.
Yeah, it was only after that I realized just like there really wasn't a lot of motion in the camera during scenes. Like scenes were set up and then they happened and you watch them and then we moved to the next scene. There wasn't a lot of cuts and close-ups and reaction shots, as you were saying. And I didn't feel it in the moment, but I thought about it afterwards. 'Cause I was like, man, that felt really different. Like what was different about it? And I started thinking about how the camera really didn't move a lot.
So, Michael, getting back to our original point, you hate horror films. Would you recommend this to somebody who doesn't like horror films?
I would, Tim. I think this is an awesome piece of history and just a really immersive classic film. I was scared away because of like the horror genre on this, and even though it's older, I was like, it's not worth the risk, right? Like if it's gonna scare me away. So I'm really glad we watched this one. I really like this. Like definitely a good fit for somebody who isn't a fan of jump scares and these things. But yeah, really a great story, and I really enjoyed it. What about you? I mean, you watched a million of these movies. How does it stand up?
This one stands up really well for me. This movie has such great atmosphere. This movie feels like Halloween to me. Now, for some people who are really intense horror fans who love the blood and guts and the gore, they're not going to find that here. But I think there's still so much good on display that I think you'd be hard not to find something to love in this movie as a major horror fan. Thank you guys so much for listening. This has been Cup of Tea's Spooky Reviews.